Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We're champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Lu Ngo, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together.
Hello and welcome back to the show. As you sail through the sometimes turbulent waters of existence, are you the type to view yourself as the captain of your own ship or as the mere passenger at the mercy of the tides? Well, in this episode, we're exploring the concept of locus of control and its role in our pursuit of happiness. And joining us in this discussion is psychiatrist and psychoanalyst Carrie Barron, serving as associate professor in the Department of Medical Education at the University of Texas Dell Medical School. Carrie has been published in several peer-reviewed journals and the Harvard Business Review. And additionally, she has penned a book on building happiness called The Creativity Cure, alongside a variety of Psychology Today blog posts on well-being topics. So we're extremely fortunate to have her here with us today. Welcome to the show, Carrie.
Oh, thank you so much, Marie. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. I'm really excited to talk about this with you. But before we do that, tell us about your background and your experience with happiness.
Sure. So as you said, I'm a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, and I've been very, very interested in trying to help people in workshops, in individual sessions, in my community to achieve a higher level, more actualized, more satisfying way of living. And I think for each person, there's a different method, but there's lots of evidence-based procedures and interventions that we can think about to help people. But yes, that's a important matter for living.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful cause, a wonderful driver for what you're doing. And I'm really curious to know what's the most common misconception that you've heard about happiness?
Yeah. So maybe I would frame it more as an expectation rather than a misconception. But I think that there's a wish, a desire, a hope that we can quote unquote live a happy life. And I think nothing is permanent. So we're always going to have conflicts or challenges or unexpected, unpredictable things, uncertainties. And really, what we can hope for is a better way to manage those things that doesn't really knock us down and knock us out. So when we talk about happiness, it's a way of somehow remaining elevated, with good boundaries, with a strong sense of self in spite of what happens. And that might be my way of thinking about happiness. Not so much a giddiness through life, Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. And I'm really excited to delve further into detail, but I would also love to get to know you better first. So, this is Have You Met Carrie? And my first question for you is what is your favorite book?
My favorite book. I have many beloved books, but I would probably say that my favorite book is Jane Eyre by Jane Austen.
Yeah,
I
and
mean,
what do you
sorry,
like?
not by Jane Austen, by Charlotte Bronte. Sorry. Yeah, I like the Jane Austen books too. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and what do you like about that?
I think she's a very complicated, nuanced, beautiful character in her capacity to adapt, kind of talking about, what I was just referring to before, and her capacity to feel joy and pleasure from internally generated phenomena. Like she was
Yeah.
somebody who really wasn't dependent on external circumstances to create meaning in her life.
Yeah, and it sounds like this is someone that I think a lot of people would look up to in terms of their happiness journey, even though it's not a an actual person. But I think like looking up to fictional characters is completely valid, for direction. And as for movies, are there any that you've enjoyed recently?
Yes. So, lately I've been more interested in series, and I would like to just refer to a movie that is always on my mind. Casablanca, filmed in 1942 with Humphrey Bogart, is I think timely for us now because there what's to me uplifting about the film is what we're seeing is very elevated character in terms of caring about others, having compassion for others, caring about the community, caring about the world, and wanting to do the right thing, which for me as a spectator is very inspiring. And when you see the opposite, it's kind of deflating. So, in a funny way, I think good character or the illustration of good character can lead to happiness, like a vicarious happiness. When we watch a person doing good, makes us feel better in a way about living.
Yes, that's exactly why I love watching feel good movies, even though for some reason I feel like it's a bit frowned upon. Like a lot of people are really into dystopian films, and I do see the appeal as well. The fact that it gets us to really think and mull over the parallels to our actual world. But sometimes you just have to watch a feel good movie to feel good. And what about podcasts though? What are you listening to at the moment?
Mhm. Yes, I will. I can tell you about that too. But I agree with you so much because distraction is a very valid form of achieving an elevated state, and it's okay. We shouldn't feel guilty about it. So, yes. So the podcasts, probably the podcast that affected me the most in my life was Serial. I know a lot of people watched that and downloaded that. That was a long time ago. But I like to listen to Hidden Brain. I'm very interested in listening to experts, on what they would advise about well-being and good living and the well-lived life, and also just stories of people that have managed difficulties and how they have adapted and survived them.
Yeah,
It's
I love
always
that
very
too.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's always great to hear a mix of expert advice and real life stories and experiences and kind of combine the two, and take cues from both of them, because they can be so different in terms of like, how you can apply them to your everyday life. But it's always really interesting and insightful to hear from the both of them. But what about role models? Is there anyone that you look up to either in your professional life or your personal life?
I've been fortunate enough to have many great role models in my life, from teachers, my parents. Yes. So, right now, there's a psychoanalyst whose work, she was a contemporary of Freud's. Her name is Karen Horney. And I've really enjoyed her works because she's very forward thinking about certain issues that affect women and relationships. And it's her thing is she doesn't use the term locus of control, but it has a lot to do with generating pleasure from internal places and finding love. Love doesn't necessarily have to be in a partnership, but we can have loving moments, loving relationships with friends, with relatives that can bring a sense of solace and nurture into our lives. So she's wonderful. But it's interesting that you should ask this question because I just discovered a new a person who I find very inspiring. Her name is Anne Burgess, and there's a there's a series on Hulu right now called Mastermind, and it is about her work for the FBI. She was very instrumental in creating FBI profiling of criminals and trying to understand how their minds work. But a very understated, dignified, brilliant woman who was really about the work and caring for others and was not so much about promoting herself. And I find that really fascinating in another human being. So, yeah.
Yeah, those are some really good picks right there. Thank you for sharing that. My
Sure.
last question for you is: has there been a course or a class that you've taken that has stuck with you to this date?
That's a great question. Well, when I was in college, I was an English major, and I don't remember the name of the course, but we studied a book called Boethius, The Consolation of Philosophy. And it was written, I don't know, many, many, many years ago. And it's really about this concept. Again, it gets back to locus of control, about self-possession. Again, this idea that we know who we are, we know what our values are, and we make decisions and move through life with that core groundedness of self-knowledge and self-awareness. But I would say also that one of my former teachers and professors at Columbia, Dr. Otto Kernberg, um, has some courses online, and I've taken some courses of his about different kinds of therapies and ways of understanding other people through a very formal, what's called diagnostic interview. He teaches this online. It's called the structural interview. But how important it is to ask questions in a caring way, a non-intrusive way that allow the person to come forth and their conflicts to arise, so that we can be super helpful if we have a great understanding of what's going on with them. So he's good at
Yeah.
helping people learn how to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating and actually applies really well to me as well. As someone who interviews people for a living, I've always found that coming from like a more caring, from a caring, I guess, direction, allows the guest to feel cared for and open up a little bit as well, without feeling like it's an invasion. So that's a really interesting one right there. But how have you felt like it's applied to you in your everyday life?
I think I personally, and maybe other people too, we need reminders, sort of, goalposts for living, perspectives for living. And I think that, when you accept certain uncertainties, perhaps lower expectations, understand your own limitations and strengths, and have kind of a good, healthy self awareness without too much self criticism, or with rational self criticism. I mean, sometimes we want to be critical of ourselves because it helps better or even feel better. Those all those works. I mean, through Dr. Kernberg or this book Boethius. There's another one by Samuel Johnson called Rassalis. It's a fairy tale. They're all really about the same thing. It's about the journey. It's about the process. It's about being nimble and adapting and accepting, really, of what you can do and what you can't, and having an open mind and open heart. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but those things it's helpful to me to think that way about living for myself.
Yeah,
Yeah.
completely. And I think it ties really well into our episode for today as well. So why don't we get into the main interview now that we've gotten to know you a bit better?
Great.
Okay, so for starters, how would you define happiness?
hmm I think happiness is an elevated state of being that is impermanent, where you can forget concerns and be totally at one with or present with the experience that you're having, and feel lifted by it.
Yeah, and how would you define locus of control? What kind of relationship do you think locus of control has with happiness?
Mhm. So locus of control is sort of a narrative or a perspective, a way to understand the world, that gives you agency. So, and that is linked to happiness, because agency, self determination, the idea that you have some say, influence, control over circumstances, rather than feeling that you're being acted upon, things are falling upon you, you're being victimized, you're helpless. There's a way in which, in spite of the things that are coming from the outside, the external, if you're a child, you can't control what teacher you get, this kind of thing, a feeling that you can have an impact and cultivate your experience in some way. So locus of control gives you some autonomy in your life. It's a perspective. It gives you some
Yeah.
autonomy.
And how would you describe the role of locus of control in everyday life? What does it look like?
hmm Well, you could go through life kind of shielding, hiding, avoiding, being afraid what's going to befall me, what's going to hit me, who's going to do what to me, there are people who've experienced trauma, right, who for very understandable reasons have that kind of guarded shield, something people can do things to me and I can't do anything about it. So we certainly want to be understanding of that. But if we can cultivate in everyday life a sense, okay, I'm waking up today, here's what I think is going to happen, or here's my schedule, or here are the people that I'm going to see, and I might be afraid of this, or I might be anxious about that. I might look forward to that. I might be excited about that. But where can I have voice? Where can I, move the needle a little bit in whatever is going to occur?
Yeah, and what is the difference between an internal and external locus of control?
Right. So, the books that I referred to before, all of them, Jane Eyre, Boethius, Rasselas, they're very much grounded in a sense of an internal locus of control that I am bringing forth my energies, my perspective, my leanings and proclivities to a situation that's in a certain way that is protective of happiness and well-being. Whereas external locus of control is when things are coming at you, where you have no decisions, you don't have responsibility for it. The thing about I wanted to say about this is, the external phenomena um, that you can't control, it seems largely negative, but there are situations or psyches or periods of time where maybe we want an authority figure to be guiding us, mapping out the, path for us. They know more, they have trod this before. There's something about it's not always bad to like relinquish control to someone else. It just
Yeah.
depends. So
Yeah.
that's yeah.
That actually brings me to my next question pretty well, which I was really curious about because most sources seem to suggest that one's locus of control may either be internal or external. But I was wondering how accurate this was. Is it possible for one's locus of control to fall somewhere in the middle or, sometimes be one like internal, sometimes be external? Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's a great question because I think it speaks to the complexity of the human condition, right? So we might say that someone might have a leaning in one direction or another. In our psychiatric lexicon, we think of people who might have dependent tendencies or avoidant tendencies. They might be more about following the external, maybe because they're afraid, maybe because they don't trust themselves. So a personality type, a personality structure might be more externally focused. Some narcissistic there are subsets of narcissism, and some of them involve, ironically, I think, being quite externally focused, very much concerned about the impression one is making on other people, very vigilant to impression management and awareness of other people's reactions. So I think there are inherent personality structures, whether they are from development or from genetics, that create a tendency. On the other hand, I think, I've done some work on creativity. That's always been very fascinating to me. And I think some people who march to the beat of their own drum, I think that was Thoreau, if I'm not misquoting, who talked about that. People who really can hear and heed and listen to internal phenomena that might be going against the grain or that may not be the most conventional, but there's a great power in that and an aliveness, a vibrancy for people who are able to do that. So those might
Yeah.
be internally and more internally directed people.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you also did mention that, one's locus of control may be dependent on their genetics or their upbringing. But what are some other factors that may influence one's locus of control?
Right. So, adaptive experience. So if you are, first of all, as we move through life and we change and we grow and we have different kinds of experiences with different kinds of people, we might feel more safe in a situation to be ourselves, less safe in a situation. One might be in a situation where they have to report to a boss or a teacher or someone who will not want to hear their voice. So there might be consequences for speaking up one's instinct, one's intuition. There's a lot of work now in medicine on psychological safety. It came out of research from a Harvard business professor, Amy Edmondson. And the idea that one has the freedom to express their instinct, their intuition, their sense of a situation without having to be guarded against what they think the boss, the teacher, the leader wants to hear. So I think it can be adaptive to be quieter, or it can be adaptive to speak up. It depends on reading the situation and and also what one's own tolerance for risk is. That's another thing.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. It sounds like from what that you've shared, from what you've shared with me so far, it sounds like locus of control is almost innate in the sense that even though it can be changed, there are so many factors that have developed our locus of control to a certain point. So, how viable is it for individuals to shift their locus of control? What are the main challenges that arise in situations like this?
So I'm a fan of the idea of sort of gather and reflect before you act. Think before you act kind of thing. It seems simple and it's just not that profound a statement, but actually doing that psychologically can be very challenging for some people. So what we're really talking about is automatic compliance, right? Because of a fear of not complying, because of a need to please, because of, I don't know, wanting to be likable. There may be ways in which we go against the grain, we go against the self. So taking a minute, 10 seconds, a minute, whatever, to really understand, okay, I may agree to do this, but in my heart, I know I don't really want to, but it may be adaptive for me to do it in this moment. Or to find a way to say, hey, great idea to that person, or I really hear you. I mean, that might be hard to do to someone who's one's superior, but I was thinking that this might be important or that might be important. So a way to integrate, so teaching yourself not to have automatic compliance, I guess is what I'm saying, and practicing that, because that can feel difficult for some people.
Yeah, I do have a lot of difficulty with that. I often do the automatic compliance thing where I gather and reflect before I act, as a way to kind of like ensure that I'm doing the right thing, to ensure that whatever I'm acting on is the right decision. But oftentimes, we live in a very fast-paced world, and it's like once the window of opportunity is gone, it's weird, it's kind of odd to go back and be like, actually, I don't want to do that. So what advice do you have for people in this situation? I don't imagine that I'm alone in this.
Where let me make sure I understand what you're saying, where you feel that you acted against yourself, you acted too, excuse me, you acted too quickly. Is that what you
Um,
mean?
in a way, like I complied too quickly, if that makes
Complied too quick.
sense. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes. Um, you know, when people recommend these behavioral things like meditation or journaling or mindfulness, it's a way of hearing those internal cues. So if you develop a habitual practice of hearing yourself, and it doesn't have to be on the spot, at the job, at the school, but 10 minutes a day, you just sit and let your thoughts arise and just try to understand yourself and what they are and your feelings. You get better when you're in a challenging situation. You get better at identifying them in the moment and articulating them appropriately or in such a way that does not sort of inflame another person, hopefully. Yeah.
Yeah. That totally makes sense. So thank you for sharing that. I'll definitely keep that in mind. Another thing I was really curious about is that having a strong internal locus of control. I think you mentioned this actually at the start of the interview. That it could potentially lead to harsh self-criticism and lower self-esteem in some cases. I can't remember if that's something that you touched on. But it sounds like without a balance, it could potentially lead to that. So, what are your thoughts on this? How accurate is that? And how important do you think balance and self compassion is?
Oh, I think it's very important. I think that internal locus of control has to do with an energy and an agency and a desire and the feeling that you can have an influence or affect what's going on. So when people become very self-critical, they have what's called a harsh superego in psychoanalysis, which means that you feel very, very guilty. You always feel like you're doing something wrong. That can become so oppressive and, really debilitating for people. It's a different kind of problem than whether or not you feel you have control over a situation or whether you feel that the external has control over you. Your attitude towards yourself and your critique of yourself, um, it's much better if it can be compassionate, like you talk about self-compassion. Compassionate critique. What does that even mean? It sort of means rational critique, right? Like starting out with, okay, I'm going to have flaws, I'm going to make mistakes, I'm going to make some bad decisions. That's just human. I mean, there's no way to avoid that. And so to be able to understand that, okay, what was my role in this situation? What did I do? And in this way, this does dovetail with locus of control. What was my role in the outcome? What steps did I take? What things did I say that made this positive outcome? Right. So giving the self some credit, pat on the back, however you want to put it for that, but an honest, realistic assessment of what you actually really did that was helpful. On the other hand, you could look at yourself and you could say, okay, I did some helpful things. I did some unhelpful things, perhaps. And what were they? And why did I do them? Was I particularly stressed that day? Was I anxious? Was I triggered? Do I have some kind of, trauma that arises when someone speaks to me in that kind of voice, or whatever? It's just understanding what happened and saying, okay, like maybe that wasn't ideal, but I can work on that. We all have something to work on. So I don't know
Yeah.
if that answers your question, but
Oh yeah, 100%. That's definitely answered loads of questions for me, and I think it'll be really useful for a lot of people because I don't think it's rare for people to feel like this. I'm pretty certain that a lot of people feel that way at some point in their lives, or maybe just have a lot of friends who feel that way like I do. I'm not sure which is correct, but moving on. Contrary to most sources, this is what I've read, that an American social psychologist, his name is Bernard Weiner. Weiner? I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. Weiner. He has criticized the idea of locus of control and has suggested that it should be separated into two dimensions, which is locus and control. And the argument is that some internal events are uncontrollable and some external events are controllable. So someone could have an internal locus of control, but still feel like they lack control. So what is your view on this? And what is your view on this?
yes, I don't think they have to be mutually exclusive. To me, it kind of goes without saying that locus of control is a perspective that you can have an influence on the environment or on the circumstances in spite of the fact that there are powerful external forces directing things in a way, because that is just basically the human condition. So here's an example. Viktor Frankl, who was a Holocaust survivor, a psychiatrist, I believe also, I think he was a psychiatrist or maybe he was a psychologist. But he basically survived a concentration camp. And one of the things that he did was he was thinking about his wife's face. No matter what was done to him, they could not take his internal thoughts from him. They could not take away the image of his wife's face in his mind. So what he was basically saying is you have control over your perspective, and no one can take that from you.
Mhm.
So it's empowerment in the context of circumstances you can't control. I mean, I think that many people in the therapy field, many people in medicine, many caregivers, this is really the human challenge. Like, how do we create hope, and how do we create agency, and how do we create empowerment or a feeling of those things when there's so much coming from the outside, whether it's an illness or a loss or a betrayal? Our job as therapists is to try to find that spark, that vitality, that life that can do in some way in that person.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting to hear. And I feel like I've learned so much from you about locus of control. I've had some really good pointers from you. And now I would love if we could talk a bit more about the practical day-to-day application of developing a more balanced locus of control. So what is a habit that you recommend practicing in order to develop a more, I guess, internal leaning locus of control?
Right. So ask yourself, what do I really think about this? What do I really feel about this? When something happens, when someone speaks to you, when you're given, some kind of instruction or order, the key is you don't have to say what you think to the person, but you have to know what you think. That's the difference. You have to know what you think and feel, and then you can decide what you're going to share or how you're going to channel those feelings and thoughts. So that's, I think, a practice is like asking yourself the question when something happens: how do I think about this? What do I feel about this?
Yeah.
And learn to do that.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of multitasking, and at least for the first few goes, it sounds like well, personally, I don't think I do it very well. I usually reflect after the fact. So what is your advice for kind of trying to remember this throughout your conversations?
It all comes back to, mental health is in many ways dependent on self-awareness. Because if you don't know who you are and how you work, right, you're probably not going to make decisions or create statements or comments or writings or whatever it is that move things forward, for you or maybe for others. So that's what I would say is that, there's this, a saying in medicine, physician, know thyself. You have to know, right? So I'm a great believer in insight. I really am. I mean, I just think it can be so liberating and so helpful for people to understand themselves. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And how useful do you think it would be for people to journal these reflections? Maybe perhaps kind of put a pin in it in their minds, and then at the end of the day, kind of jot these down to kind of, I don't know, have some record of it. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that? How useful do you think it'll be?
Well, I'm a great believer in that too. I believe in journaling, writing, recording. There's something about the concrete action of the hand, the physical action of the hand. There's a saying, the hand is the window to the brain or the window to the mind or something like that. I mean, so writing does not have to be an anxious task. It doesn't have to be a dutiful task. It can be, the writing doesn't have to be good. It just has to be from your heart and from where you're at in the moment, from your present state. So I do think that writing and journaling can be very helpful. Research has been done on this, on, when people write down a secret that they've been holding that can bring relief. If they write their emotions 15 minutes a day, that can bring relief. So I also think that those are exercises in self-awareness as well.
Yeah. And I I believe I have pointed out a pretty common challenge that would arise during such situations. But from your experience, what are some common challenges that people face when trying to develop that internal locus of control?
Can create anxiety. I mean, I think that when you look inward, sometimes it can rattle you. People often want to numb themselves, have distractions, which are fine. I mean, it is really fine to have distractions, pleasures, whether it's films or feel good films or novels. We do need that to some extent. It's really a matter of, are you finding a place and a time to be with your reality and to be with the things that are going on in your life in such a way that you can work with it, in and take the next step forward. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. I feel like I've learned so much from you. I honestly didn't have a very clear idea of what locus of control was or is before this the filming of this episode. So I've been really enlightened by you and I really appreciate it. And I hope everyone has found this helpful as well. So now let's move on to the open mic section. This is your chance to talk about anything that you are passionate about, and this doesn't have to be related to the topic. So the floor is entirely yours. Please take it away.
Oh, wow. What am I passionate about? Well, I have 3 children. I'm passionate about them. I care a lot about, with I think about this too for my training. What are the things that help a happy life or a good life? It's capacity to be very interested in something or to work, the capacity to love, to have warm, caring relationships that are honest, with other people where one can be one's authentic self. And also I would add play to that, which is linked to what you were talking about with the feel good films. Because an area in your life where you can be spontaneous, silly, laugh, that isn't so thinking, but just really being in it and letting go is very important. So I always think about those 3 things with regard to certainly my children, but also just, the people that I care for, are what's happening with them in those ways. I've been very passionate about creativity, which is linked to that, in my life, because I think that whether or not you have greatness, or whether or not you have imagination in your everyday life and can approach problems with an open-mindedness and a curiosity, it doesn't really matter if you're creating great works that are going to last, ad infinitum. I mean, it really is in the day to day. An open heart, a curious mind are very useful for well being, and I feel passionate about those things. And I'm just, from the time I was a child, I used to pretend that I was a therapist. My parents were therapists. So I used to like play games and make up, scenarios and try to pretend like, and I would ask my mother, like, what would you do in that situation? I was like 10. So I was always very interested in why people did the things they did and how you could sort of, I don't know, help them if they were suffering. I was just always very interested in that. So yeah.
That is adorable. I can't say I did that as a child. I was actually pretending to be a cashier when I was a child because I found the buttons and the sounds really fun.
I get that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But to your point about creativity and locus of control, it's something that when I was preparing for this podcast, I was really interested to know as well, but I couldn't really find a place to put this in. But I was wondering, as someone who's written a lot about creativity and done a lot of work on that, and talking about locus of control now, what are your thoughts on that phenomenon of writer's block or creativity block?
hmm Oh, there's so many reasons for it. It might be that we don't want to delve into something that triggers us or makes us frightened or, anxious. It might be a confidence question. It also may be an intolerance for imperfection, because when you're starting out learning how to do something, maybe it's watercolors, maybe it's music, maybe it's writing, there's going to be a lot of imperfection and a lot of stumbling, a lot of inelegance in the process. You can't reach a mastery until you've gone through all those rough patches. So, yeah, I mean, I think embracing and not feeling humiliated by the learning process is really, really important, I think, also for
Yeah.
well-being. Yeah.
That actually definitely answers my question. I mean, I do realize that a lot of the time when I first start on a new art kind of pursuit, and I'm not so familiar with, the various techniques and how they should look and what mistakes look like, I always get very, very excited, and I'm always churning out like 5 different pieces of work when I first start out, and then I realize, okay, I want things to look a certain way, and I need to do this in order to get that, and then I start kind of stopping that pursuit because I feel like it's too much and it's a lot of I just don't have the confidence to continue, and I kind of think of it as like a creativity block. So that definitely answers my question, and I hope that does answer some listeners' question as well. I just think it's really fascinating, so thank you for sharing that and for joining us today. If our
Oh,
listeners
sure. Thank you.
Yeah, if our listeners want to find out more about you and what you do, where can they go?
Sure. So I have a website, Carrie Barron MD, that can tell you a little bit about my practice. I have a private practice, and I, do some educational work and some other kinds of work. So yeah, and on my blog on Psychology Today is, I've had that since 2012, and I've written on a lot of topics, families and relationships and happiness and well-being, lots of things. So that's the work is there. Psychology Today.
Amazing. We'll link that in the show notes. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Carrie, do you have any last pieces of advice?
Well, thank you for doing this, because I'm, and I'm honored to be here, and it's been wonderful to talk with you, and your questions are so interesting. And I think it's lovely that, you're creating a product that hopefully can help people in their daily lives.
Well, I hope so too.
Thank you.
And thanks for joining us today. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
You have been listening to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by the Happiness Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website, ha.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Lu Ngo. Thanks for tuning in.